Hello, and welcome to a History of Egypt podcast interview. My guest today is Dr. Colleen Darnell, who's going to speak to us about New Kingdom historical fiction. This is a genre of work within the ancient Egyptian canon, in which scribes would describe the deeds of earlier rulers as works of literature in their own right. Dr. Darnell published a book on this subject in 2013 titled Imagining the Past: Historical Fiction in New Kingdom Egypt. Colleen sat down with the show to discuss this book, the texts themselves, and the various ways we can imagine ancient writers engaging and even playing with fiction, tropes, and historical people. It is a fun discussion, ranging from the calamitous death of Seqenenra Tao to the triumphs of Thutmose and Ramesses, to the divine pageantry of ancient chariots, and why the pharaoh is more like Superman or Sherlock Holmes than you might expect. Anyway, allow me to introduce Dr. Colleen Darnell. Good morning, Colleen Darnell. Welcome to the History of Egypt podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderfully, and I'm so happy to be here.
Excellent. You're speaking to us from the eastern United States, Connecticut region. Is that correct?
Yes, we are in a small town in the middle of Connecticut.
And you've just come back from an excavation or project season in Egypt. So what were you working on at the moment?
In May and much of June, I was working with my husband, Professor John Darnell, director of the El Kab Desert Survey Project. And this project has been going on for a decade now. And we've been tracing ancient desert roads going into the eastern desert around the ancient city of El Kab, and then recording the rock inscriptions, graffiti, as well as archaeological remains along the roads. And it's been really spectacular because there's an area that had essentially not been surveyed and not been mapped. And we've just found hundreds of rock inscriptions and dozens of sites.
Excellent. Anything particularly noteworthy or exciting that you can give us the scoop on?
So there was an article that came out in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Interconnections in December that John wrote on a new inscription of a man named Hori, 18th dynasty, who is out in the desert, and he's asking for water in the well and gold in the desert from Nechbet of El Kab and Horus of Edfu. And it was really amazing getting to participate in the epigraphic copy as well as the translation of the text. And it's just such a nifty offering which the king gives, but not the expected funerary material, but what Hori wants to find out in the desert.
Fantastic. And as somebody who wanders around in the desert fairly regularly, is there a particular deity of the desert who you're quite fond of in the record?
The goddess Hathor is definitely the goddess to whom people appeal the most in a general desert context. So we think about Sad a lot because he's certainly present and very significant in the oases. But it's Hathor, and I find that so interesting because of how it ties in to the theology of the goddess of the eye, the sun, and the idea of being in the desert and the goddess coming in and greeting her at the beginning of the new year. And the main road going from El Kab through the Wadi Halal, there are several temples to the goddess Hathor, and to see how that all fits together, both in monumental formal architecture as well as in the rock inscriptions and personal records of worship, I find that particularly amazing because we can essentially stand where these ancient people stood and think about the sort of festival performances that would have occurred on an annual basis.
Excellent. So I've brought you here today to discuss one of your recent publications. Well, we say recent, it's probably about 10 years old now, actually. Gosh, time flies. But you, about a decade ago, you published a book on New Kingdom historical fiction, as you defined it. To the casual audience, this might be something they've never really heard about with context of ancient Egypt. You know, we have modern historical fiction about it, but the idea that the ancient Egyptians are writing their own historical fiction about their history might not be so familiar to people. So very briefly, what is New Kingdom historical fiction? What are the major texts and when are they being written?
Through my my study, I was able to identify four ancient works of historical fiction. They all date to the Ramesses period. So between the reigns of Ramses II and Ramses III seems to be the date of the extant copies of the papyri. And obviously, that's always a good question of, are there earlier versions of these texts that could have been written? But what we have are the quarrels of Apepi and Seqenenra, so set in the Second Intermediate Period, but the papyrus is dated to the reign of Merneptah. We have two stories, again, 19th dynasty in date, set during the reign of Thutmose III, and then a story set to the reign of Ramses III that might have been composed about the time of his reign, maybe a little bit later. So it could have been fictionalized even by the end of his reign about his Libyan campaigns. And the definition of historical fiction that I use is essentially the same as for modern historical fiction, that it is an invention of certain events and characters, but set within a historical framework so that there's either a real event that happens or real characters that are present in the historical record. And then a fictional story is woven around those elements. And because the ancient Egyptians were so great at record keeping, there was so much investment in maintaining libraries, maintaining records, both in the monumental presentation, but especially on papyri, thinking here of the Turin King's List, that they're using their knowledge of their own history to then weave entertaining fictional tales. And I find it remarkable that the ancient Egyptians composed their own historical fiction and to find that sense of enjoyment in that genre over thousands of years.
And so, as you mentioned, the surviving papyri that record these texts tend to be middle to late 19th dynasty, approximately. But of course, ancient Egyptian rulers and military leaders have been going on expeditions, getting into all kinds of adventures for centuries before these tales are being written down in the form that survives. For the audience, some of the earliest examples of the sort of adventure tale are the biographies of people like Harkuf and Weni from the Old Kingdom, going out into foreign lands, coming back, telling people what they've experienced, or Ankh Tifi of Mawala, with his kind of pseudo-royal biography of campaigns and economic activity during the First Intermediate Period. Today, we might commonly think of these adventures as being primarily a New Kingdom phenomenon, simply because the record is so much better preserved there. But to your understanding of the historical record, when do you think this type of story, this kind of biographical adventure tale with military elements or that kind of material, when did they begin to emerge? Do you think it's Old Kingdom, First Intermediate Period, or older? What are your thoughts?
That's such a fascinating way of thinking about the literary history of Egypt. And because of the limitations of the extant sources, I wouldn't want to make a guess saying, okay, historical fiction is going to be present in the First Intermediate Period or going to be present in the Middle Kingdom. But the way I think about it is that there are three genres that do go back to the Old Kingdom into the Middle Kingdom that really are necessary for then the creation of historical fiction. And where we see that come together is the New Kingdom. And there could be many 18th dynasty compositions, for example, Astarte in the Sea, dated to the reign of Amenhotep II, where one papyrus completely changes our understanding of the literary record because each of the four works of historical fiction are only attested in a single papyrus. So one gets destroyed and suddenly you're missing that entire tale. So among those three genres that I think are essential, the first are those autobiographical texts that you mentioned, carved on tombs in tomb chapels and that record significant events during a person's lifetime. And sometimes those do focus on either military events, such as Weni's leading of a military campaign multiple times, and that beautiful poetic passage of returning from the land of the sand dwellers. And then you also have adventure and exploration, such as the autobiography of Harhuf. At the same time, you have actual expeditionary records in rock inscriptions that an expedition leader or through a scribe is leaving at the site. And grammatically, those will often use what we call narrative infinitives. So these very basic forms of going out to the desert region by, and then whoever the person or the group may be. And those expeditionary accounts that seem to be a day-to-day record on papyrus, we can guess, as well as then presented in a more formal way in rock inscriptions, those then inform and are adapted by the day books into, for example, the annals of Thutmose III, those beautiful records of the Battle of Megiddo and the almost 24 additional campaigns during his reign. So he's drawing both from this standard genre of presenting events in one's reign, which really gets started for kings at the end of the First Nemean period. Antef II and the Houndstila, I'm thinking of here, and Montuhotep II at the dawn of the Middle Kingdom. And it's interesting, likely because of the conservative nature of the institution of kingship, that we first see these presentations of autobiographical events in the non-royal sphere. And then particularly because of the regional aspects of the Theban dynasty, then adopting something that nomarchs of their family had probably been doing for quite some time, and then using that for royal texts. And then that continues. And then, of course, the third element that we need is fictional literature. And I find it especially fascinating how some of the stories of the Middle Kingdom, the shipwrecked sailor, for example, the story of Sinuhe, involve travel, involve adventures to foreign lands. And so everything is really set up, everything is there to then innovate and create a genre of historical fiction. But it could already exist in the Middle Kingdom, and we're simply missing those stories. But I would be pretty confident to say that by the time of the 18th dynasty, I think such texts are probably being composed. But if we want to be the most conservative, we can say the first time it's actually attested in the papyri.
As always, with the asterisks that tomorrow somebody might uncover something that completely resets the record as we've described it. Two questions that arise from those answers. First one is kind of informal, describing all these texts, Hakuf, Weni, the rock inscriptions. Do you have any plans to look at this as these all as a kind of holistic corpus, and publish a book looking at kind of desert adventure tales of ancient Egypt? Are there any thoughts on that kind of work?
Actually, there is a book that's just coming out. I don't know if it's formally published yet or not, by Vincent Morel, that
Okay.
describes this interaction of expeditionary and literary texts, focusing particularly on the Wadi Hammamat. And that also relates to some of the work that John published in the Theban Desert Road Survey Volume 1, where you have a inscription of a priest, and then someone actually copied out in response part of the story of Sinuhe, the letter from the story of Sinuhe. And it's incredible to think someone had memorized that or had a papyrus copy and was carving this literature out in the desert. So a lot of that material has been published and is coming out, although I'd always love to write more about the literary aspects of military texts, going all the way back to my 2003 book, The Great Karnak Inscription of Berneptah. That's been one of my primary interests as a scholar.
Well, that's kind of what I was getting at with the question, is kind of like a historical fiction, imagining the past, part two, like looking at these things from that lens. Any plans to do that kind of book?
That would be interesting. My publication schedule is a little packed at the moment. That's one thing with archaeological work, is you record so much data and then the amount of time that it takes to process it. But I do plan in the future to return to literary aspects of historical text, because I think that's a wonderful way of planning out a part two, is the fiction side of the military, but then looking more at the literary side of actual military text as opposed to the military aspects of the fictional text. But that would be, so much secondary literature to go through for that topic as well.
Fair enough. And the other sort of subsidiary question I had, thinking about people like Harkuf, Winnie, Angtifi of Mawala, or more recently for the New Kingdom, somebody like Ahmose, son of Ibana. For these individuals, we have these wonderful inscriptions that adorn their tombs, either in the chapel, or even in the case of Harkuf, on the exterior wall, looking out over the river. One thing that I often try to stress for people who are not as familiar with ancient Egypt is that while we call these structures tombs, they are to some degree more like private chapels with a burial space inside, preferably secluded or concealed. So people are supposed to visit them. They're supposed to visit Harkuf or Weni or Ankh-Tifi, and they're supposed to visit Ahmose Bana and read or see what they have done in their life. Keeping that context in mind, how do you imagine the recitation or performance of these texts? Do you think they're aimed solely at somebody who comes to the tomb and can read them as a biography? Or do you think they might have hoped that people would read or even sing them to an audience gathering at the tomb? How do you imagine the transmission?
I imagine this like the banqueting and festival scenes that we see depicted within the tomb chapels. And I agree, it is so significant to emphasize that when you are visiting an ancient Egyptian tomb, the decorated upper portion of the chapel, you are actually fulfilling the ancient Egyptians' intention for creating that space and decorating it. And although I don't think there's any direct textual evidence of this, I could see an aspect of the reading aloud or even the performance of different aspects of an autobiographical text or an inscription describing, say, Ahmose son of Abana and his spectacular military exploits, that this being a particularly appropriate time to celebrate those accomplishments during, in Thebes, the beautiful Festival of the Valley, or other local equivalents to that in El Camp, and essentially telling the story to the family, much like a veteran of World War II or another war would pass on those stories to his children. I think I like to see that aspect of it. The We don't have a text, unfortunately, that says, "And now this inscription is going to be read to my grandchildren." But Ahmose, son of Abana, gets as close as possible when he says, "I'm speaking to you so that you might know what I have done." And I like to put that together with the obelisk inscription of Hatshepsut, where she very specifically addresses generations after generations. And so not only are the ancient Egyptians, when they carve these texts and put them in their tomb chapels, intending for their direct descendants to read them, but I think because of the tremendous length of ancient Egyptian history and the fact that they're aware of the amount of time of that history, that they do think about people thousands of years from now. And the historical fiction then from the New Kingdom is such a great way of seeing the ancient Egyptian appreciation for the past, much like the visitors' inscriptions in the step pyramid complex of Djoser, this idea of actually visiting something as a tourist. And I could see that being part of the intention for the tomb chapels and the types of texts that we're discussing.
Excellent. Okay. So let's move now to the royal stories, which are the four subjects, four tales that you focus on in the book, which again is Apep and Seqenenra, the capture of Joppa, Thutmose III in Asia or in the East, and then the Libyan Wars of Ramesses III.
Mm-hmm.
The first tale we discuss is that of Apep vs. Seqenenra, also known as the Quarrel of Apophis and Seqenenre. This is a tale set around 1570 BCE, when Egypt was divided between the lords of Waset, or Thebes, in the south, and the Hyksos in the north. It is a tale of arguments leading to war, and we know that this conflict did not go so well for the historical Seqenenra. His mummy, now in the National Museum in Cairo, shows a man who died brutally in battle. But centuries after his death, the tale of Seqenenra and his arguments with the Hyksos were still a story worth telling. very briefly, let's discuss the New Kingdom historical fiction pre-Ramesses II. One of the most famous texts that you discuss in the study of historical fiction is Apep and Seqenenra. Very famous tale, work of proto-nationalism for the Theban monarchy, if you will, famously immortalized by the author Naguib Mahfouz in his own landmark work of historical fiction. But many of the aspects of that story show that it wasn't actually written at the time of the tale that it is telling. It is genuinely, by your analysis, a piece of historical fiction. My question here first is, for an Egyptian language scholar, you're given a text like Apep and Seqenenra that purports to be taking place around, say, 1550, late 17th dynasty. What is it about the text that gives away, actually, this was written centuries later?
There are two ways that we can approach this. The first one is, what is the date of the papyrus text that actually preserves the tale? And so Papyrus Salier 1, we know, dates to the reign of Merneptah. So at least the extant copy that we have, we know for absolute certain that that version of the Quarrels of Apepi and Seqenenra was written during the reign of Merneptah. Then the next element you have to say, when was the text originally composed? And for that, you look at the grammar. And so the grammar of Apepi and Seqenenra very much follows that of other New Kingdom stories dating to the Ramesses period, which is this very nice literary late Egyptian grammar. So it would not be the grammar we would expect for a tale composed during the end of the 17th dynasty or beginning of the 18th dynasty. There are some elements that could go back that far. So we can't rule out that there's a kernel of the story or part of the plot that was in circulation earlier. But everything about the works of historical fiction that can be identified point to 19th, or then for the Libyan battle story, 20th dynasty date.
Okay. Speaking on that note of the date, as you mentioned, the surviving copy of Apep and Seqenenra dates to the late 19th dynasty, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
That is roughly 300 plus years after the events it is describing. It would be the equivalent of a modern author writing a war story in the reign of Louis XIV. How much material do you suspect an ancient Egyptian scribe would actually be able to reference from something that far back in their history? It's not 1,000 years, but it's still a substantial chunk of time. And these are events that might have been carved on a stela or recorded in some monumental fashion, but we have no proof of that. How likely is it that a scribe of the late 19th dynasty could accurately describe a story of the 17th?
I think it's very likely. And the specific piece of evidence that I would use to sort of support that supposition is the stela of Kamoza. The fact that the second stela of Kamoza exists as a hieroglyphic record, what an amazing discovery of the 20th century, and Libby Pabaji's publication. But then the fact that on a writing board discovered by Howard Carter, financed by Lord Carnarvon, of the Carnarvon tablet, which actually has a hieratic copy, student's copy, scribe study copy, we don't exactly know, of the missing first stela of Kamoza. And if 3,000 years later, we can discover a hieroglyphic record and a plastered wood board with an additional hieratic text, I think it's very likely then that there would have been dozens of papyri relating to the history, the king's list, the events of the late 17th dynasty that a Ramesses scribe could have consulted. I mean, even the fact that the mathematical papyrus has certain events of Ahmosa's conquest of the Hyksos. I mean, actually, one of the mathematical papyri has little jottings of certain events at the very end of the 17th dynasty. So the fact that so much survives even until today, I think we have to suppose that there is a substantial library of historical records that the ancient Egyptians would have been able to access.
Excellent. Now I'll ask you about a story that may or may not have a accurate historical inspiration, which is the capture of Joppa. So this tale is quite famous for its Trojan horse style deception tactic, or maybe we should more accurately say that Troy is famous for its Joppa-style deception tactic. The next tale we address is the capture of Joppa. This takes place around 1480 BCE, in the reign of Thutmose III. In the story, an army commander named Jehuti is laying siege to a town on the Canaanite coast, the city of Joppa, or modern Yaffo. His solution is intriguing: to hide warriors in baskets, smuggle them into the city, where they can leap out and achieve a victory. It's a fun story, with some interesting historical bases, and some very clear parallels in later traditions. The general Jehuti pretends to be giving up the siege of Joppa on the Levantine coastal region. He presents a gift for the local ruler, but within these large wicker baskets, supposedly holding the treasure, there are Egyptian soldiers. The Joppites. Joppites? What do you call them? Joppians? Joppites?
Citizens of Joppa.
Citizens of Joppa. The people of Joppa bring the baskets in, the Egyptian soldiers leap out, difficulties ensue. First of all, this trope of attacking by hiding within an object. Does this appear in any other ancient Near Eastern literature of the time or of subsequent Bronze and Iron Age stories, or is it specific to Joppa and then to Troy?
The only two that I was able to find, and over the course of the last 12 years, potentially new ones have been discovered. But really, the Trojan horse is the only similar tale from the ancient Near East. The other closest parallel is actually in an 11th century CE Persian epic of the Shahnameh. And it describes, again, a city being besieged, and the general isn't able to secure the city. He isn't able to capture the city, and so he actually sees it as it being less than chivalrous, less than honorable to use a stratagem, but it's the only option he has. And it's very similar, where he has soldiers go into a large chest and then pretends to be a rich merchant bringing in his caravan of goods, and then the soldiers leap out. You will often see in association with the capture of Joppa not only the Trojan horse, but the story from 1001 Arabian Nights of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. But that's not a good parallel at all, despite the fact that it gets mentioned a lot, because there's nothing military. It's, again, thieves and a merchant. And when the thieves hide in the large ceramic vessels, they get boiling oil poured over them. So it doesn't succeed at all. But it's interesting that that's the example that often gets mentioned in descriptions of the capture of Joppa. But I think the Trojan horse is really the outstanding similarity. But I wouldn't say that there's any direct connection between them, because such a stratagem is entirely possible as an independent development.
Fair enough. And one thing we should note is that the subject of this tale, the General Jehuti, was a real person, and parts of his tomb or his burial have been discovered in the Saqqara region, although I believe the actual tomb itself is currently lost again. We only have a few pieces of the burial.
Correct. So the tomb was probably found by whoever then sold off some of the pieces in the 1840s, but the tomb has not been rediscovered. And when that happens, if there's an autobiographical text in that tomb, that is going to be truly an exciting moment. But there's a beautiful golden bowl in the Louvre, as well as a scarab, and the titles and canopic jars. And so those titles allow a tie-in to the Jehuti of the capture of Joppa, exactly as you mentioned.
I was hoping we get that autobiographical text. The third story is that of Thutmose in Asia. It's kind of a montage of King Thutmose III's many campaigns in the region of Canaan and Syria. This is a badly fragmented tale, I haven't read it on the podcast, dating to a time after Ramesses II, probably the 20th dynasty. So it looks back on a ruler who was already 200 years in the past by the time it was composed. The tale of Thutmose in Asia is an excellent example of the genre evolving, and even starting to reference itself, using other works in the same corpus to make its literary point. You discuss a story called Thutmose III in Asia, which is based on the not the famous, I was going to say legendary, but they're very much not legendary. The famous campaigns of Thutmose III throughout this region, repeated attempts, expeditions, stomping around Canaan, Syria, subjugating, forcing people to pay tribute, killing where he needs to, destroying, etc. But I want to discuss this tale from a slightly different perspective, because within the book, one of the key things you highlight is how the story of Thutmose III in Asia kind of copies directly from another famous tale, which is the Battle of Kadesh. Within this tale, you include a section where Thutmose III gives a speech in the midst of one of his campaigns. And I'm going to read the speech out loud for the benefit of the audience. So Thutmose III in this tale says, "I found my heart courageous, my heart in joy, all that I had done having succeeded. I was like Montu, the war god, while their chariot spans became like Sutek, great of strength, Baal in his moment. I was shooting my arrows on the right and capturing on the left." And you highlight this because this is basically a copy of part of Ramesses' speech from the Battle of Kadesh in the, I believe it's the poem of Pentawere, the poetic version, rather than the bulletin, where Ramesses says, "I found my heart courageous, my heart in joy. All that I did succeeded. I was like Montu. I shot on my right and made captures on my left. I was like Sutek in his moment in their sight." The reason I give this lengthy preamble is part to set the context, but also because it's an interesting example of how an author of a later generation is telling a tale about a very famous king, but he's cribbing, if you will, from another famous king to tell this story. And the reason I thought this was interesting is because we have such abundant and well-documented records of Thutmose III for his campaigns. Why would an author who is writing about Thutmose, famous conqueror, take a speech from Ramesses II and give it to this earlier ruler? What is going on in this text? What is the effect of this?
I believe the intent of the author is to directly link the military successes and victories of Ramses II with his illustrious predecessor, Thutmose III. And what this most reminds me of in a more modern context, although not necessarily that modern, is the fact that Julius Caesar and Napoleon both wanted to become the Alexander the Great of their time. And if there were to be a historical fiction story about Julius Caesar or about Alexander the Great, but say written during the reign of Julius or lifetime of Julius Caesar, to then have a speech of Julius Caesar in the mouth of Alexander would be absolutely perfect. So I think it is this idea of linking famous figures over time and wanting to cast Ramses II in the best possible light. I mean, he truly is, in a way, the hero of the tale because I think the educated scribes who wrote, and probably several people, because again, if Pentawere has his copy of the Kadesh battle poem, other people certainly did, and they could have even owned both papyri. And the idea that you could compare those two and then think about how great Thutmose III is and how great Ramses II is, I think a lot of it is for these royal positive aspects of self-presentation, and obviously the word propaganda can also fit in there in terms of the identifications with as we still say today, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. And so there would be that desire to form historical connections.
Okay. In these tales, Thutmose III in Asia, which then directly quotes from Ramesses II, the scribes who are telling these tales, you've suggested that they might be sharing notes, or they might be reading them aloud to one another and kind of enjoying the play that they're doing. Oh, I recognize what you're doing there. You're copying Ramesses II. Again, kind of going back to that performance question I had earlier about biographies. Do you think of these stories being read aloud and performed in public contexts?
Because of the limited literacy in ancient Egypt, I think it's certainly possible to suggest the stories being read aloud. I think that is a very enticing proposal. And although we don't have a text saying, and then the scribe read aloud the story of Sinuhe or the eloquent peasant for everyone's enjoyment. There is direct speech, obviously, in these texts. Not only could a narrator have told the text and played the different roles, but for all we know, there could have been some sort of dramatic reenactment where you have the king come on and make a particular speech. And maybe there was even a visual combination of something to do with Thutmose III and Ramesses II. That's all entirely speculative, but I certainly would not rule it out. And I think it's also important to emphasize that the episode with the roaring hippopotami in the Quarrel of Apepi and Seqenenra, the fact that the ruler of Joppa asked to see the Awenat staff, and then Jehudi says, "Sure, I'll show you the Awenat staff," and smites him over the head in a true Three Stooges like moment. Less humor in Thutmose III in Asia and the Libyan battle story. But I think there are enough entertaining elements that even someone who wasn't necessarily aware of the history, it could be fun to hear the story. Just like historical fiction today, the more knowledge you have, the more you're going to enjoy it. But if you don't have that historical knowledge, it can still be a fun read. And then the scribes who did know the history, who were in on the composition and the world of elite military scribes or someone close to the royal court, they would enjoy the tale on another level. So I don't see the audience for these stories being restricted only to a certain profession or a certain class. And the way to expand the audience would exactly be performance or reading the text aloud.
That's interesting because it seems like in scholarship, we do tend to stress the elite context of their composition and their writing, but there doesn't seem to have been as much attention, perhaps because of the lack of evidence, for the performance and what that could possibly do for disseminating the tale outside of that context.
I completely agree. I tend in these sorts of interpretations of literature to err on the side of a wider audience. But that's certainly debatable. I mean, it's hard to draw that line. But with Middle Kingdom literature, where it might be a little bit more obvious of the shipwrecked sailor would be something that everyone would enjoy. But if you were an expedition leader, if you had traveled in the Red Sea, if you had gone to Nubia, if you were someone who had completed that expedition to Nubia and knew the challenges, you would appreciate the shipwrecked sailor on a completely different level than, say, an 8-year-old who really likes the talking serpent. Again, this is taking modern perceptions and imagining what it might have been. But I think it's important to at least try out, at least consider a more expansive view of the audience of historical fiction in the New Kingdom.
Finally, we have a text called The Hymn to the King in His Chariot. Again, this probably dates to the 20th dynasty, after Ramesses II, and it describes, in glowing terms, the power of the ruler over all foreign lands, and how the chariot itself symbolizes that dominion. This hymn includes a lot of wordplay, like puns and double entendres. For example, describing the weapons in the chariot, the hymn says, quote, "The spears, or chemiut, are the steering oars, chemiu, at the backs of the foreign lands. The javelin, niwi, is the fear, neru, of you that has entered into them. The dagger, cherep, it terrifies, cheri, those who are in your grasp. The sword, sephet, is your strong arm that cuts down, sephet, the rebellious mountains, and they fall to pieces." End quote. We'll explore it more fully in the future at the appropriate chronological point. But the discussion here is quite interesting because it mixes the Egyptian and the foreign, the human and the divine, and the pageantry of an ancient sports car / weapon of war. So another story that you cover is the Libyan tale of Ramesses III. I'm actually going to put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it in the future if you're willing to join us again for another interview, because at the time that we're recording, the podcast narrative is still Ramesses II. We'll leave those future rulers for another discussion. And instead, I want to get your thoughts on another text which is not in the book, but which you have published separately. And this is called The Hymn to the King in His Chariot. To a casual audience, that might seem like a strange title. Why would a scribe make a praise for the king specifically in his chariot rather than just, oh, the king is great generally? What's so special about the chariot?
First, I should also point out that all of the titles we've been discussing are modern inventions that pretty much just describe the text, and we don't unfortunately have the ancient titles. I like the description of the hymn of the king in the royal chariot because although it does seem a little odd, why in the chariot, it really describes what the text is all about. And chariots for the ancient Egyptians were the race cars of the day. You could go faster in a chariot than any other mode of transportation, and for it was also a prestige vehicle. And for the king, it was not only how he is shown and likely actually led in battle or participated in the battle in his chariot, particularly if we're going to believe Ramesses II at the Battle of Kadesh. And I think we likely should that he was somehow involved directly in the chariot battle and led that in some way, even though he only selectively will highlight Mena in the textual record via the picture versus the pictorial record. So the king does fight in his chariot, as we can see from both images and text. And because in the hymn to the royal chariot, some of the parts of the chariot are associated with gods and goddesses, I think we have an extra thread, an extra symbolic thread, which is the solar significance of the chariot that we see most prominently at Amarna, where Akhenaten appearing in the chariot of Electrum is just like the sun god. And this appears in other texts as well. So, riding in and out from the North Palace to the central city at Akhenaten, the king is actually enacting the solar cycle.
Okay, that's an interesting point because you raise in the discussion in the article about this particular text that the chariot description also includes numerous foreign words that seem to have been borrowed from Near Eastern languages and used for the chariot. The first question here is, why is the author of this particular text specifically using foreign words rather than Egyptian to describe the components of the king's chariot? He is the king of Egypt. Why isn't he describing an Egyptian-made chariot, if you will?
I think the chariot described in the hymn to the king and his chariot was an Egyptian made vehicle. They would have incorporated potentially foreign woods and to create the chariot and materials, semi-precious stones, for example, that would come from quite far abroad here, thinking of lapis lazuli and its origins ultimately in Afghanistan. But because the chariot does enter Egypt from Eurasia, it makes sense that then some of the names for the chariot parts are foreign. What I think is particularly notable about the hymn to the king in his chariot is that they then use puns of some of those foreign words to actually express the subjugation and the defeat of the foreigners. And this whole turning a word around to say, okay, we're adopting this word. And I don't think there was any nuance of because you're using a foreign word, you are somehow showing your support for one thing or another. I think it's just as the chariot came in, certain vocabulary came in. And the vocabulary that we see for the royal chariot is the same in the hymn. As the vocabulary for the parts is the same in the hymn, as we know from descriptions of chariots in entirely secular context. But the puns, I think, are the key. So, for example, the handrail, which is the chaws or takes away the morale of the foreign troops, or the awenet, again, that same staff that we see in the capture of Joppa, which is how I got on to doing the analysis of the hymn to the king in the royal chariot, is you see that word in Joppa, and then you see that word in the hymn to the royal chariot, and then that becomes a fascinating text, so you want to publish that. And I certainly want to do more work on that hymn. I don't think the last word has been said on that. And so the awenet staff, because that root awen means to plunder, it plunders the foreign lands. So it's this use of vocabulary and puns to show that when you looked at every part of the royal chariot, there was a little story to be told about how that specific part of the chariot assisted the king in his conquest or represented the conquest of foreigners by the king and the Egyptian army.
Okay. And you touched on earlier the sort of divination of different components of the chariot. One of the, I'll highlight two examples to get the point across, we have the wonderful chariot of Thutmose IV, which is now in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, that shows the king being attended by Montu as he charges into battle. And then we have the famous instance from the Battle of Kadesh, where Ramesses calls out to Amun, and his voice echoes all the way to the south in Waset, and Amun appears in the chariot beside Ramesses to empower him and to give him victory in battle. When we think of the chariot itself and how it's described in this text, do you think pious Egyptians, people who genuinely believed in their deities and the natural forces that could empower the king, do you think they might have genuinely perceived the chariot as being something of a divine vehicle itself, something that the gods were present on when the king went forth to battle?
I think so. And another example of that, a little bit more directly in terms of a physical object, is the ram-headed standard of Amun that has its own chariot that goes into battle with Ramses III. So, and the fact, obviously, that the different divisions of the Egyptian army are named after gods. So you have the division of Amun. And I do believe that we should take their statement seriously, that when they associate the chariots with the gods, then yes, they would have seen them that way. And I really like the iconographic example of Montu supporting the king in his chariot. I love that, he's right there as the king is shooting. And that fits perfectly with the intertextuality between the Kaddish battle poem and the story of Thutmose III in Asia, where Montu is also present, and he also comes as winds, which is a really nice image. And the idea that you needed the support of the gods in order to win a battle. Amun-Ra, handing the king the Chepesh sword, is giving divine sanction to the military activity. And again, we can draw this through to the Trojan War, although the Greek gods are certainly a bit more fickle in terms of their support of their chosen parties. But the religious aspects of war, I think, are very important for the ancient Egyptians, and even outside of a military context, because of that connection between the sun god and the chariot. I think there is a religious aspect, a sacred aspect of that particular prestigious vehicle. At the same time, when you had 2,500 chariots, I don't think the Egyptians would look at that and say, "Oh, wow, that's an entire pantheon out there." I think it's contextual, so that every time they got in a chariot, they didn't think, "Oh, wow, the handrail seizes a foreign land," but everything can be viewed on multiple levels, and I think that's something that is foundational to how we interpret Egyptian thinking and needing to contextualize it. But I like how you put it about, differentiating between really pious Egyptians who saw this in a more literal sense, and yeah, the dispute of a man with his ba, and the idea that Egyptians could also question the veracity of some of their beliefs, I think is also important, because that is so rarely highlighted in discussions of ancient Egypt, particularly for the general public, for an audience like yours, to have this idea that it's not all just blind allegiance to the king and the gods, but there truly was internal debate and thinking about concepts from different perspectives.
I recently did an interview with Professor Peter Brand about the Battle of Kadesh, and specifically about Ramesses' accounts of that. And one thing that he highlighted, which ties into what you were just saying, was that one of the remarkable things about the Kadesh story, as it's written in the poem or the bulletin, is how freely Ramesses admits to his errors in judgment, if you will, or the strategic mistakes that are made in the lead up to Kadesh. It turns out all right because he's got that divine wind behind him. But the sort of forthrightness with which Ramesses admits to getting duped, essentially, by the Shasu Bedouin and the king of the wretched one of Hatti, sort of fits into what you were just saying, in the sense of there is a lot more ambiguity here with how this society is viewing these tropes. But who can deny that that chariot is really splendid when the king is racing across the battlefield, and that's a powerful image.
I think that is significant. And the idea of the king not being perfect also could encourage the composition of historical fiction, thinking here of the portrayal of Seqenenra. And because we're missing the end of the story, we don't know whether Seqenenra really ends up being the victorious party, because we know in actuality he died in battle, probably was killed while he was in his chariot, in addition to when he was then taken to the ground. But there's a rectangular hole in the shape of a Hyksos battle axe in his skull. So that's kind of interesting, thinking about, okay, Ramses II willing to admit a mistake and being foolhardy in his headlong rush without allowing the other divisions to catch up during the course when they're actually ambushed by the Hittites. But then, how do we apply that? How could that potentially inform the fictional accounts of the kings? Is very significant.
Oddly enough, the example that comes to mind as you're saying that is Superman, who ironically is in the pop culture zeitgeist at the moment we're talking. But one of the things I consistently read about from people who have written Superman comics or movies is the challenge of writing a being who is all powerful. How do you make him interesting from a dramatic perspective, similar to the Egyptian pharaoh? He's all powerful. He's a superhuman. He's a living god. The ways to make a character like Superman or Ramesses interesting is that they make mistakes, or that they have flawed information, or quite simply that they're put into a situation where the odds are genuinely seem to be overwhelming in a way that they're not prepared for. It's interesting to see the ancient Egyptian authors potentially grappling with this same issue. How do you make Seqenenra interesting if he's an all-powerful king? Or maybe he dies at the end. Or how do you make Ramesses interesting when if he just goes to Kadesh and captures it? Oh, he actually really messes up. Again, probably speculative, but do you see any kind of that kind of author's agency in the composition of these tales where they might be playing with these ideas?
The first thing that I thought of when you were talking about this connection between or viewing Superman like Ramses II is that Ramses II's hubris is his kryptonite.
There we go.
And
Perfect.
I agree. I think that because you have a king who is intended to mediate between the gods and people, who is supposed to, as we know from the king as solar priest, enhance Ma'at and destroy Isafet. What happens when the king doesn't quite succeed in destroying Isafet? And how do you resolve that tension? And fiction is a way to do that. Fiction is a way to do it safely, because you are not directly criticizing the king, you are putting it in the context. And again, we don't know whether the fact that Seqenenra died in battle is somehow, do they continue the story? I doubt it. Into the success of the 18th dynasty, do they leave it with Seqenenra is an ineffectual king and Al-Pepi is the anti-hero? That's been suggested. I'm not sure how convinced I am of that. But until we find at the end of the tale, it's really difficult. But I think conceptualizing the position of king in ancient Egyptian society, and how do you write about that in a dramatic way? How do you make it interesting? I think is important when looking at historical fiction. So the entertainment value, the interaction between the king and foreigners, and things that could go wrong in a military sense. And then the added element of another way to make the story interesting and give it more flexibility is make a general, rather than the king, the hero of the tale. And they do that obviously in the capture of Joppa with Jehudi. So they are approaching things from different levels. And as you mentioned, it's speculative, but I think it's a great approach.
And the other example that comes to mind is how, not necessarily through fault of his own directly, but it is almost implied within the text, which is that when Thutmose III is on the verge of total victory at Megiddo, he loses control of the soldiers, and he is thus denied that immediate victory. And the story continues into a more difficult phase with the 7-month siege. Again, whether we take this story event as genuine history or a literary invention, it's an interesting wrinkle to the tale that the all-powerful king doesn't fully have control of his own troops in their bloodlust.
In both cases, it's also interesting how the failure of the Egyptian army at Megiddo to immediately follow up on the victory, the immediate victory, the immediate defeat of the enemy forces, and the fact that Ramses II puts himself in a position where he can be ambushed, that very challenging situation that needs to be overcome then casts the king as someone who's even more heroic because he can come back from uh he can recover from a setback and then still go on to victory. And that that's a nuance that, again, I think this idea of the king as this semi-divine being, we don't often convey, I think, enough that they can think about the king as an individual, as a person, and put him in a historical context. And I think part of that is because we don't see that from the beginning. We don't see that in the Old Kingdom. It's only something that develops, but often in presentations of kingship. We're going to go back to Khufu, and although he does get it in later literary texts, but again, does that go back to something that people told at the time? It's a fantastic question to consider.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll bring the questions about the heroic narrative of this historical fiction to an end, with the asterisk that perhaps in the future we can have you back to discuss Merneptah and then Ramesses III and their amazing adventures. If you have time, I'd love to ask you a couple of questions about just life and your own interests in terms of historical fiction and media, and then we can say farewell.
Absolutely.
Great. One question that I try to ask of every scholar who comes on is what initially brought you to ancient Egypt as a field you wanted to study?
I have a feeling that I have the same answer as a lot of people, that this is something I've been interested in ever since I was very young, not because there was a particular museum collection or object, although I grew up in St. Louis and there was a small Egyptian collection, but it was really reading books, looking at the hieroglyphs, and really wanting to be able to read them. And what I have found significant about the course of my career is that that initial passion obviously continues to drive me, but at the same time, the more other interests that you have. So, for example, vintage fashion, and then doing increasing amounts of work on fashion in ancient Egypt and the mechanics of ancient Egyptian clothing, as well as interactions with iconography, that specific interests change and you get to add so military history and fashion, military history and its expressions in literature, and obviously an abiding passion for the netherworld books. So yes, definitely goes back to childhood, but it's fun to then see how particular interests and foci of research develops and evolves.
Fair enough. And then one final question, which is another variation on something that I ask of every scholar. If you could go back in time with a time machine and meet one ancient Egyptian person to sit down for a day, have a conversation with, who would you like to meet and why?
Because the obvious Akhenaten and Nefertiti I use a lot. I'm gonna go based on our conversation, Jehudi, to hear about his actual exploits, see what he would think about a story being written about him. Maybe there were even kernels of that during his lifetime, but I think to talk with him both about what he did and let him know that he's still very famous, I think would be a lot of fun. And for Reign of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, I would love to have a conversation with Mahu and get his perspective on what it was like being the chief of police during such a tumultuous period in ancient Egyptian history.
It sounds like it might be quite a dark conversation, but certainly an interesting choice. So, Colleen, Dr. Darnell, thank you very much for joining us to discuss historical fiction. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope you'll consider coming back in future to talk about Merneptah, Ramesses III, or the books of the Netherworld, which you published with your husband. So thank you very much for speaking with us.
And thank you so much for having me. This was such a fun conversation, and I very much look forward to being a returning guest.
Excellent. My thanks to Dr. Darnell for speaking with the podcast. If you would like to learn more about her work, both her academic publications and books for the general public, you can find these on her website, colleendarnell.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. For those who want to go deeper on particular topics, Colleen also runs online classes about ancient Egyptian history, culture, religion, and more. To see what classes are coming up and how you can join, simply visit her website and choose the tab labeled Classes. Again, link in the episode description. That's all from us. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon on the History of Egypt podcast. Cheers!